All right. Welcome, Addie. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm super excited for this. I think you and I have similar ways of thinking about things, and I think it's going to be a really good crossover for all of them. So I will let you introduce yourself. Do you have like an intro slide on here of your bio and stuff? Give them a quick intro. I told them that they should all, I think a few of them are already following you on Instagram because I think your stuff is just it's entertaining and informative, like in all the best ways. So I will hand it over to you. And if any questions come up, you guys feel free to type it in the chat. And then Addie, don't feel like you have to answer it right away. We can go through them at the end as well.
I wonder if I can even see the
chat. Let me type just in the chat so you can, it'll like, oh, hold on. So it'll pop up. You should see like something red flashing. Yeah. So you can pull it up from that.
Okay, cool.
All right, cool. Turning it over to you. Oh, no, wait.
Hi.
You did you instead of me. Awesome.
Hi, I'm Addie Holzmann. I am a doctor of physical therapy. I'm also certified in postural restoration and am a personal trainer. So I am a pelvic health therapist. So if I'm a little like woo today, I like just got home from seeing clients all day, so my brain is a little like all over the place, but I'm super excited to talk about pelvic floor and running. I love working out, I love running. Female athletes are kind of my niche. So we're gonna have a lot of fun, and I love that the groundwork has already been laid a bit by Allison as far as how I think and how the body's all connected and how breath is so important. We're going to be talking a lot about breath because that directly impacts the pelvic floor. So you can use your breath to your advantage, especially when you're running. So let's start with just like some anatomy. That'd be a good place to start. We have 3 layers of our pelvic floor. So I have all kinds of bones over here. So this, our pelvic floor is like our muscle. And if you, maybe I should, is it easier if I'm bigger? Am I big or am I small right now? Am I big enough, Allison?
I think I made you bigger. Yeah.
So the pelvic floor is like a bowl of muscle in the bottom of the pelvis. So it has many really important jobs, which we will talk about, but there are 3 layers of the pelvic floor. So the first 2 layers are more sphincteric. So they are gonna like close the openings of the anus and vagina. They're gonna support more of that urogenital diaphragm in the front. Lots of fascial connections and layers in the pelvic floor. But what we're really going to talk about today is that deep layer of the pelvic floor, because this is the layer that does all the things like supports your organs and supports your joints and all that good stuff. So when I talk about the pelvic floor, because we're going to dive a little deeper, I figured I can do this with you guys because the groundwork has already been laid as far as running and single leg stance and mechanics, the arch of your foot and how that impacts your pelvic floor. So I think of the pelvic floor in 4 quadrants. A lot of people just think, oh, the pelvic floor, it's like, you know, one big muscle, or it all does the same thing. That's not true. It's over 12 different muscles, and depending on your pelvic and your hip position, those muscles are in different length tension relationships, right? So you might have tightness in one quadrant of your pelvic floor and then be like lengthened in the next. So thinking about those quadrants, you have a front and a back and a left and a right. And so we'll dig more into that because kind of learning your pelvic floor and how to control it, you want to know that it's not all doing the same thing all the time. And it does also correspond with your breath. So that is, we will dig more into mechanics, but I wanted to show you my cool anatomy app. I hope that I don't screw this up. I've never shared my screen before. Maybe I won't be able to find it. I don't even know. Let's see. Oh, that's fine. Well, I'll use my my models for you, but we're going to go into what the pelvic floor actually does. So if you can remember the 5 S's, the pelvic floor is stability for our joints. So it crosses or goes over the SI joints. It supports the pubic joint in the front. It has connections into the hip rotators. It stabilizes your tailbone. It is involved in stabilizing your spine. So that joint stability is a huge part of that pelvic floor. So when people have back pain or hip pain or even knee pain, ankle pain, sometimes that is related to the pelvic floor and how that pelvic floor is functioning. It supports our organs. So we have bladder, uterus, rectum, and that deep layer of the pelvic floor keeps those organs inside us. So if you're dealing with things like prolapse, which I've been there, it's the dissension of those organs because that pelvic floor isn't in a good position to be supporting those organs. So then they descend, and there's different layers of or levels of prolapse, but it can be pretty severe. So sphincteric, we talked about how it closes off the urethra and the anus to keep things inside when we want them inside. It's a very important function. It acts like a sump pump. So the pelvic floor and how it moves helps pump our blood and our lymph. And if you think of like how our body is constructed, there's actually an issue called pelvic congestion syndrome, where things kind of pool in the pelvic floor, like liquids, like blood and lymph, they don't get circulated through. Well, that action of the pelvic floor with our breath is really important to be pumping fluids through our body. So that's not a really common thing that you hear when you talk about pelvic floor and function, but another common issue that women have is varicosities, like in their vulva. That's another like sump pump action of the pelvic floor to keep things flowing so they're not pooling down there. And then sexual function, which obviously very important. It allows for orgasm. It responds to penetration. So the pelvic floor, it's amazing how important these jobs are and how little we think about all of those jobs until something goes wrong, right? That's when we start like, oh, I can't hold my pee in. I better start, thinking about that pelvic floor. So it's a very under talked about part of our body. But here's some issues that may alert you as to your pelvic floor is not functioning quite like it should. If you're peeing more than every 2 to 4 hours. So voiding is about every 2 to 4 hours or 5 to 7 times a day. So there's a thing called urgency or frequency where you feel like you have to pee all the time. That can be linked to the pelvic floor and how those muscles are functioning. So that is a problem. That disrupts your life. If you have to, everywhere you go, think about where's the closest bathroom. I can't sit in the car too long, or I can't be out too long. That is very disruptive. So another function is leaking pee or poop and running and mothers. The leaking is a common conversation now, or it's becoming more common, which is awesome because we need to know about these issues so we can fix them. But anytime that you void without wanting to is leaking. So it doesn't matter what it is, or well, pee or poop, but like anytime, it doesn't matter when it happens. If it's not intentional, there might be a problem there. The peach is hemorrhoids and anal fissures. So tightness in the back of that pelvic floor. If your sphincter muscles in the back can't relax, things aren't going to get out, right? So that the sphincter muscles need to open so that things can come out. When that doesn't happen, you can get backed up and constipated, Or you can get fissures, which are like little cuts like around the sphincter muscles, which are very painful. So those are common things there. Pain in the vulva, so the vulva is the outside, or the pelvic floor muscles themselves, anytime. We should not be having pain there unless we're like giving birth. That might be the only like time that pain is acceptable. POP stands for pelvic organ prolapse. So again, that's any dissension of those 3 pelvic organs. There's actually a lot of variations of POP. You can have like just the anterior pelvic wall, so more just like tissue that descends down. You can have each of the organs. There's like bowels that can come down in the back that basically these are impinging on the vaginal canal. And then if it gets bad enough, they're going to come out the vaginal opening. Pelvic girdle pain. So thinking about the joints of the pelvis, you have your SI joints in the back and your pubic joint. So pain in those areas. Tailbone pain is very common, especially after birth. So a lot of these muscles connect to your tailbone. So if you have tightness in the back or just an asymmetry in the pull, that can make your tailbone pretty angry. And then, you can expand on that. Any spinal pain can be linked to the pelvic floor, hips, knees. I could probably relate almost any musculoskeletal pain to the function of the pelvic floor because the pelvic floor is part of that core system, which we'll dive into in a minute. We talked about constipation, and then painful sex is actually way too common, but something you can definitely address with physical therapy or working on your pelvic floor. So let's talk about just breathing and pressure. So when I think about the core system, I have a balloon here to kind of mimic this. So thinking of the core system, we have, I call it an egg because I think of the Easter eggs. So if you have, we'll do your skeletal egg first. You have your bottom of your egg and the top of your egg, your rib cage. So we're talking about the pelvis and the rib cage. So this is your bony egg. So if you take one of those plastic Easter eggs, in order to put that egg together and for it to snap shut, it has to be stacked, right? If you're putting it like, like shifted or not putting it down evenly, it's not going to stack. So that's kind of how I explain posture in the relationship between the pelvis and the rib cage. Underneath that bony egg is your muscular egg. So that is the inner core system. So when I talk about core, I'm talking about the diaphragm on the top, the pelvic floor on the bottom, and the deepest of your abs, the transverse abs, which go from your ribs down to your pelvis and all the way around. They're like your natural corset. So this is that deep core system. And the 2 major roles of that core system is 1, breathing, and 2, pressure. So our bodies and our movements operate off of pressure. If we didn't create any pressure in our bodies, we would be just a big puddle on the floor. Like we wouldn't be able to move, right? So that intra-abdominal pressure is key when we need to be upright or lift heavy or move. And so it's that deepest core's job to create that pressure, those transverse abs. The tighter they pull in, the less space, the more pressure, like very basic physics, right? Less volume, more pressure. So your breath and your breath mechanics and how your pelvic floor and your diaphragm are responding to each other is going to dictate or greatly impact how you're creating and you're managing that pressure. So normal breath mechanics, if you're in that stacked egg position, so if you have your diaphragm here and your pelvic floor, right, and you're stacked, when you inhale, that pelvic or that diaphragm will shorten or flatten to pull air in. and that pushes on all your guts, and then your pelvic floor lengthens. And then as you exhale, that diaphragm domes up again, right? It relaxes, and then the pelvic floor is actually in a shortened position. So they play off each other. So think inhale, everything goes down, exhale, everything comes back up. So it's like piston breathing is what Julie Wiebe calls it. So that works optimally in that stacked position, because if you're stacked, your abs in the front are keeping that relationship or connecting your pelvis and rib cage. If you are, so that pressure can go up and down. If you're cracked or your back is tight, or your chest is out, that pressure then is just going to go out your stomach. So thinking of like diastasis recti, or like abs that won't engage and work for you. The air or the pressure is going to go path of least resistance. So that's why that stacked position and those abs connecting the front is really vital for that pelvic floor movement. That I'm like laying a lot on you as far as breath and pressure, but those curved lines are showing you kind of how that dynamic should work. And if we get stuck in, let's say our ribs are really open, like pregnancy, like your ribs have to open because, baby's in there, or your pelvis is tilted forward, or you have a tight back, or there's so many things that lead to like a disruption in that stacked position. Your pelvic floor might not move enough. Maybe it gets tight, right? And then you start having symptoms of a tight pelvic floor, or that diaphragm is just flattened and pushing down all the time. So maybe you get prolapse because there's just no relief of that pressure on the pelvic floor. When our pelvis tilts forward, the inlet, or up here, will flare a little bit, and the back of the outlet, so sit bones to the tailbone, that gets tight as the front gets in more of a lengthened position. So an example, like when people jump or run, some people run in a really tight back position. If the front of the pelvic floor is in an elongated position, it can't contract to hold in everything, right? So if you're jumping and like cracking your egg, as I call it, a lot of people will leak with that because it's just too much pressure on a system that can't respond to that. So pressure is important, and how you manage your pressure is important, and that stacked position helps disperse that pressure around so you're not getting like these hot spots of pressure that cause symptoms. Any questions so far? We good? Okay. So we kind of summed this up: breath, posture, movement. So your breath and the mechanics of your breath are going to dictate your posture. So here's some examples of that. I clicked on the thing and now I can't get rid of it. Dang it. It's like I'm like feeling so not tech savvy today. Oh my gosh. Okay, so breath. So if, again, maybe your ribs are unable to get closed. So I think of the rib cage like an umbrella. This is also from Julie Wiebe, who's a really popular sports PT. So when you inhale, that umbrella opens 360 degrees. Okay, so that diameter increases, that flattens your diaphragm, gets air in for you. As you exhale, you're closing your umbrella 360 degrees. That should let that diaphragm dome back up and relax. So let's say you're stuck in like a open rib cage position where that diaphragm is flattened. That diaphragm connects to your spine, right around like that mid to low spine. So if you're here, that diaphragm will pull you forward, which will arch your back, which tilts your pelvis forward, which may lead to tight hip flexors. So that breath pattern and how you're utilizing your rib mobility and moving that diaphragm, how your abs are engaging, is going to dictate your posture and how you hold yourself. and how you hold yourself is going to impact your movement, right? So they're all intertwined, and it's really important to like start making those connections. So let's talk about stance phase in the pelvic floor. Stance phase. So when you're on a leg, and this is where I kind of need to back up this camera a little bit. I'll back up. Okay, so single leg stance. Running is a single leg stance activity, right? So in single leg stance, you need those hamstrings from the back to support the pelvis and abs from the front. Together, they bring the pelvis more in a neutral position. If your hip flexors are pulling down in front or your back is really tight, you're going to be more in that forward tilt, okay? So abs and hamstrings help that forward, backward sagittal plane. And then your inner thighs pull you to whatever side you're standing on. So if I'm standing on my right leg, I'm going to be using that right inner thigh. That right inner thigh opens the pelvic outlet and helps balance that pelvic floor. So when that opens, you're actually going to have more of a relaxed back of the pelvic floor and more engaged front of the pelvic floor. But just know that the abs and hamstrings are setting that pelvis in a position where that pelvic floor can then move up, okay? So when you're in a stance phase, that pelvic floor is essentially like helping you stay supported. So glute med is on the side. Glute med is an internal rotator, so that's going to also help stabilize you from the outside. So those four muscles are really important to keep you stable on a side. If you are standing with your pelvis or running with your pelvis kind of tilted in that forward position, you might start feeling tightness in your tailbone, or like prolapse symptoms in the front, or a tight back, or hip flexors that won't let go. And all those signals are kind of telling you that pelvis isn't getting that range of motion it needs. It's kind of stuck. So thinking about, you know, just that stance or that skeletal egg and how it's influencing your muscular egg. Things that tips, and it's funny because I just had a client today who has prolapse and she has issues running, and all I told her was to have a midfoot strike. So get her foot under her, get off the balls of her feet, and like her prolapse symptoms didn't bother her at all. So if you're on, and running is kind of a continuum, right? So like with walking, we have a heel strike. As we go into more of a fast run or sprint, we're going to be on our toes. So sprinting is on the balls of your feet. But if you're just jogging, you can definitely like feel that midfoot, and just sensing that midfoot is going to help you absorb some of that impact in your pelvic floor and that suspension, that range of motion of the pelvis, so that that bladder isn't just like, you know, like hitting an overly tight pelvic floor, or that pelvic floor is just not letting go. These are some just tips for running that I'm throwing at you to think about on your runs. Neutral pelvis and hips, so that stacked position, so your pelvic floor can respond to your breath and your diaphragm while you're running. A lot of people, especially when you get running faster, you're really taxing your breath or your respiratory system. It's like the inhale goes up into your ears. And that is almost, that's going to impact that pelvic floor, because getting those neck and back muscles activated is going to kind of crack your egg. Okay. So you want those abs to keep connected here. Think breathing down into that pelvic floor and out in the sides of your rib cage. So you're dispersing that pressure instead of, you know, doing that, because your neck is going to get real tired if you start breathing like that. And then just getting some hip rotation and running is something we may not think about. You may now with Allison, because I'm sure she talks about hip rotation with running. But like a lot of people don't rotate their pelvis maybe enough, or they shift out instead of getting clean rotation on the femur. So if I'm standing on this leg, in order to kick out or stride out with my other leg, my pelvis has to rotate towards the leg I'm standing on. That's hip internal and external rotation. That's going to help that pelvic floor kind of move through movement so it doesn't get stuck or tight, or it's not being kind of pounded on with pressure. So thinking of that hip rotation is really important. And then I call it mini punches. So with your breath, you want to make sure your abs are on. And one way I do that is kind of thinking about punching, not all the way, but like mini punches here. So as you're punching forward, my shoulder blade is coming forward. It rotates my rib cage and spine. I feel my obliques. I'm more stacked. Now when I breathe, that pelvic floor can be moving with my diaphragm. So those are all some tips that you can try if you're leaking, or if you have prolapse symptoms or tailbone pain, or even like joint pains around the pelvis or hips. So I was like diving into some research, and I found it was a systematic review. So it was, I think, I'm not really sure how many articles they looked at, I forget, but they found that in a neutral ankle, or with a little bit of dorsiflexion, so kind of dorsiflexion, you guys know what dorsiflexion is, right? You've gone through the ankle and the foot. You have a greater optimal contraction of your pelvic floor. So this kind of ties into that stance phase where that pelvic floor should be active, right, and ascended, and how if we're on the balls of our feet all the time and we never get kind of that reset with a midfoot strike, how that can be a lot of stress on the pelvic floor, and we can't move it as optimally. So that I thought that was interesting because it directly relates. So I love push with the tush. I love push with the tush. Yes, I was talking to a client today about this too. If you think about your push off or that big toe, that will help rotate that pelvis just a little bit more on that stance. So you feel glutes and hamstrings and you get that internal hip rotation. I love it. Push with the tush. That's good. So all these things are so connected, which makes it really fun to learn, but also a little overwhelming at times. I totally get that. So I hear a lot of people tell me that hills are tricky. And usually, not always, but usually running down hills is trickier for people if they have leaking or pain. And part of that's momentum. We'll talk about that next. But going up hills, thinking about that stacked egg analogy, the green guy is like what you want to be. The red guy is cracking his egg a little bit too much. So things you can do for hill running to keep that stacked position, that pelvic floor moving with your breath, is kind of digging your hands down so that instead of running up the hill, like leaning those shoulders behind your hips, you're kind of digging into the hill. That will help keep your abs on in a more stacked position. And then again, pushing off from the hip, not the back. Push with your tush, not your back. Getting that movement. A lot of people who are tight in their back, they'll just like try to push off with those back muscles, and that is going to set you up for some back pain. And then leaning into the hill with a slight hip hinge, neutral spine. So, anytime you're like leaning back, you're going to crack your egg. Your abs aren't going to be on to connect that pelvis and rib cage, which then your diaphragm's not supported, lots of pressure on the pelvic floor and the abs. So you can see like the spiral of events when those abs are so important. So important. So going downhill, some tips. So a lot of people will use their momentum to go downhill. So then they start these long strides that they can't control, and they're trying to slow down by throwing their shoulders back because it's too much. And then that's a lot of pressure on the pelvic floor. So things you can do is to shorten up those strides, and the strides are quick, but they're not so long, right? So you can control it. You can keep your eggs stacked, light, light impact. So going downhill, you have a lot of momentum behind you. You might be just slamming your feet down. Well, that if your feet are slamming, your organs are probably slamming too down on your pelvic floor. So you want suspension. I say one of my like things that I tell people is tension. So tension in your pelvic floor, if you're holding it tight all the time or clenching your butt or whatever, tension kills suspension. So that suspension of the pelvic floor, and we're going to go into like Kegels and that stuff. I probably should reverse that, but that's okay. So suspension of the pelvic floor kind of gives those pelvic organs like a nice landing instead of like bam. And then that bladder is probably going to not enjoy that. Versus I have a reel on this. If you like check out my Instagram, like dropping an egg on the floor, which is going to crack, or dropping an egg on a trampoline where it can have a little bounce. So keep suspension in your pelvic floor so that your pelvic organs are a little bit more supported. Okay, so I'm going to back up because I think I totally like got ahead of myself here. So as far as Kegels, Kegels are like, when people think about pelvic floor therapy, they think about Kegels. That's like 0.01% of pelvic floor therapy. And how you do Kegels is important. So I had a question given, how do I know if my pelvic floor is strong? Strength is being able to go through a full range of motion with control. So if you have a muscle that's overly shortened, it's not going to be strong. If you have a muscle that's overly lengthened, it's not going to be strong. You want a muscle that can do both, that can lengthen to the fullest and contract to the fullest with control. That is strength. So if people have like imbalance in their pelvic floor, maybe they're tilted or rotated or whatever, and then they just like go do Kegels. Well, one, they might not need Kegels. Maybe their pelvic floor is holding too much tension, and then you put Kegels onto that and you're going to have painful sex, pain with sitting, maybe issues voiding, like you have to push and strain to get things out. So Kegels shouldn't be a go-to if you don't know what your pelvic floor is doing. But the definition of Kegel is basically lifting your pelvic floor, right? And then a reverse Kegel is lengthening your pelvic floor. So being able to do both of those things is really, really important for control and for strength. So suspension, that's the suspension I'm talking about. So also with Kegels, the position of your pelvis is going to dictate what muscles in that pelvic floor contract. So think about like all these muscles here. That's like not all of them are going to contract if your pelvis isn't in more of a neutral position. So let's say you're tilted forward or you have really tight back and hip flexors and the back of your pelvic floor is really tight. And then you go to Kegel. Well, if the back is already tight and in a shortened position, when you go to Kegel, you might only feel the back of your pelvic floor contracting, right? So we need to get that pelvis more neutral so that the whole thing can come up and down and you're not directing that effort only in one, either the back or the front or the left or the right, only in one of those quadrants. So the inner thighs, your adductors, the pelvic floor, and your transverse abs share a lot of fascial connections. So when you're working on strength, or when I'm getting people to try to feel that pelvic floor move, if they can't already, I will have them find a neutral pelvis, which if you're really stuck forward, sometimes you have to get into a posterior tilt to like find some balance between those muscles. Now the goal is to find neutral, but I often will get people in a posterior tilt so that we're trying to get that full range of motion, not just neutral forward, right? We got to get that full range of motion if we want muscles to be strong. So anyway, getting that pelvis back, and then I a lot of times will put a block between people's knees for squats, right? So feeling that pelvic floor move with your squats, or even just laying on the floor, putting a block or a ball between your knees and hook lying, like with your knees bent to work on that pelvic floor connection. But just know that the position of your pelvis is going to dictate, in your hips, if you're internally or externally rotated, is going to dictate how that pelvic floor moves. Do we have any questions? I feel like I fire hosed you for 40 minutes. And if we need to back up, we totally can do that. My mind is just all over the place right now.
I think there's a lot of like crossover from conversations we've already had. So it's not like all new, completely new information, but just different, coming at it from different ways. So,
Good.
and they know like about the position of the pelvis, and also like we even talked about like infrasternal angles and wide versus narrow and that kind of stuff. So they have that base.
And like I came into this like hoping that was the case, because I like to dig in like further, and a lot of times I'm like talking about like laying the groundwork, so this is fun. So if you want to dig in further, or you have questions about any of this stuff, just put them in the chat, or even unmute yourself. I'm totally open to being interrupted. That's awesome. I love discussion. So okay, so we covered Kegel's strength. So how do you know, if your pelvic floor is strong? Another couple common questions: is it too late? It's never too late. It's never too late to improve your core system, your breath, your pelvic floor movement. It's never too late. We can always improve that stuff. Even like C-section scar, like if you've had a C-section years ago, there's research out there that shows that tissue mobility, or working on that scar mobility, is helpful for things, because if that, I look at it as like a quilt. So if you let's say you layered a bunch of different fabrics on each other, and if you pulled one, they're just going to kind of glide on each other, right? Like that's kind of our fascia, skin, muscle, like things should kind of be gliding. If you put a stitch in that quilt, like an incision or, a scar, if you stitch that quilt, you pull one layer and they're all going to be pulled, right? So then there's decreased mobility in that soft tissue, which can really mess with how our abs function, how our pelvic floor feels, because that scar tissue can get really deep sometimes. And after a C-section, it can form up to 2 years post C-section. So you're not like in the clear after like 6 months. Like you still got to like check in and make sure it's moving in all directions, and like different layers of skin, muscle, organs, because it can get pretty deep. So people who have had C-sections might have bladder issues because their scar tissue got so deep. So it's so simple. Like scar tissue mobilization is so simple. Like you just like rub in all directions, like in all depths. And it gets me so fired up, because it could be a handout at the hospital, right? It's not rocket science, but a lot of moms don't get that information, and then
I was talking to a trainer the other day who went through 4 pelvic floor physical therapists, and not a single one told her to massage for her C-section scar. And this is like 10 years later postpartum. Someone finally told her to massage her C-section scar, and that fixed everything.
Oh my gosh,
It's so frustrating that no one told her that before, because it's so simple.
It is. It's so simple, and you can start it as soon as, like, gently, as soon as your scab is gone. So, but I've seen a lot of moms that have trouble engaging their abs because, one, maybe they dissociated from their abdomen because of how the birth went, or something like that, but or having stinging pain with rotation because that scar tissue is just like pulling on nerves. So in order to get those muscles, those abs, which we need, strong and moving, we have to have that scar tissue moving. So it's never too late for any body improvement. And when we kind of have these like two main phases in life where, you know, we're having kids and it's really important to see a pelvic floor PT, and then going through menopause too with all the hormone changes, a lot of pelvic floor issues pop up. So just kind of having that in mind, you know, it's, if you're having any dysfunction or pain, I would highly recommend finding help. And side note, if you need a pelvic floor PT, if you're in the US, I don't know if it goes out of the US, pelvicguru.com has a ton of good information. Like they have a ton of providers in their directory. So that's a good place to go. So again, this relates into the pain after sex, after having a C-section, right? So if you have scar tissue, like sex is a pelvic floor exercise. Like it's work for the pelvic floor. And so if you think about all that movement or positioning, if there's scar tissue that's tugging and pulling, that can cause pain afterwards. Or maybe it doesn't have to do with the C-section. Maybe you just have a tight pelvic floor and you're getting pain after sex. So my big, because I always, any chance I get, I give these tips on sex because so many people have pain with sex and there's little things you can do to help. One is use lube, use all of the lube, good lube that doesn't have scents or dyes or fragrances, anything like that, because it reduces friction. So if you're having like prolapse symptoms or you have a tight pelvic floor, it decreases that friction so that you're not guarding and like, you know, holding your pelvic floor tight. A wedge is huge for a lot of people. So I don't have my stuff up here, but just putting a wedge under your pelvis. So like here, so it rolls back and your back relaxes and then your pelvis is in a better position. Like think about those quadrants, that makes more balance between the front and the back quadrant. So if you're having like pubic pain or prolapse, the prolapse stuff, it can help like bring those organs kind of back in just with gravity, being up on a wedge. So those are my like two big things if you're having pain with sex. Obviously that doesn't, that's not like the only advice for everybody, but those are two major things. Let's see. So constipation, we covered that as a pelvic floor issue. We covered pelvic floor strength. So having been told your pelvic floor is strong, but leaking at the end of a run. So strength and endurance are two different things, right? So you could be strong for a while, but if you're leaking at the end of a run, I'm thinking breath pattern, like are you cracking your egg? Are you starting to use those accessory muscles because you're getting tired? Is your diaphragm like still moving? Do you still have your core on? Because the more you get into that extension, you're gonna be putting pressure on the front of that pelvic floor and creating more imbalance in the pelvic floor. So yeah, I would really like think about that connection in the front and bringing that breath down instead of like up with the upper traps. Daily rituals, we're getting to those. And then as far as irritants for the bladder, as far as pelvic organ prolapse, I haven't ever heard that food, other than like if it causes constipation, yeah, so like processed stuff, you know, that kind of stuff. If your food is causing constipation, that can make prolapse worse because you have to strain more to like get out, so you're pushing and that pressure down. But as far as like types of food specifically, no, I would just say stay really hydrated and make sure stools are as soft and regular as possible. Bladder irritants though, caffeine, alcohol, fake sugars. Yeah, I just had a client today that cut out fake sugars and she said it made a huge difference. So citrus fruits, anything really acidic, those are all bladder irritants. So if you're eating or drinking a lot of those things, you could get that wanting to need to go to the bathroom a lot because your bladder's trying to get rid of that stuff. Also for runners, it's important to make sure you know this, hydrate, but for bladder health, because if you're someone who leaks and you don't want to leak and you're going to go work out or go run, you may think, it's not that hot out today. I could probably get away with not drinking as much water so I don't have to go to the bathroom. It's not a good plan because urine, concentrated urine, is irritating to the bladder. So if you're not hydrating, but you have this really concentrated urine, it's gonna like cue you to go. So make sure you're hydrated. And then as far as different exercises further postpartum, I would say maybe there's a slight difference in what you would do newly postpartum versus like what you can tolerate years postpartum, but the concepts are the same. Like abs and hamstrings to stack your egg. Can you feel your pelvic floor move? Diaphragm breathing, rib mobility, all of those things are still the same because we're all still human, right? So there's going to be a little bit of difference between people depending on their situation, but there's not I don't necessarily start somebody in a totally different place if they're 5 years postpartum versus like if I'm seeing them more recently.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? As far as the scar tissue stuff goes, like, you still feel like scar tissue mobility is important if you've never done it, like even
Yes.
days later?
Yes. And I just looked up some studies and they were talking about chronic, this is specific like abdominal pain associated with scars, but chronic pain or like doing scar mobs years after surgery was still successful. So you can always break up that scar tissue. It's just easier to break up when it's a little newer because it hasn't laid down as well. But you can do that years postpartum. Okay. Any other questions before we dive into some specific things you can do? We kind of talked about this, but here's some daily habits, like outside of specific exercises, which we'll get to. These are some simple things that you can do just to keep your pelvic floor happy. So a squatty potty or some kind of stool when you're using the bathroom. And this is for peeing too. The more we're in a squat position, the more that puborectalis lengthens and lets go and unkinks our rectum. So that's specific to bowel. But as far as bladder, like in a squat position, you tend to have more balance front to back. So a normal urine stream is 8 to 10 seconds. And so it should be a solid stream. Like it shouldn't be like intermittent. It shouldn't be blasting. It shouldn't be like touch and go. It should just be a nice even stream. So sometimes if your pelvic floor either being too lengthened and it's tight, or it's too tight and like shortened and tight, that urine can kind of like stop and go because that pelvic floor isn't letting go all the way for it to empty out. So squatty potty, hydrate, and nutrition, super important. Gut health and staying regular, very, very important for pelvic floor health. Standing posture. So here's a quick, like standing, you can't see my whole body, but you'll get the picture. So on your heels. So a lot of people will stand like pelvis forward or like leaning on the counter. I'm guilty of that. Or putting the weight in the balls of your feet. All of that is going to compress your low back. Your abs are long. That pressure is going down on the front of your pelvic floor and through your ab wall. So keep your hips over your heels, or like think about hinging just slightly. So the weight is on your heels. Your knees are soft and not locked out. And you're stacked. So ribs are down. You have that stacked egg instead of being up or here. You're nice and stacked. You feel that connection between your ribs and pelvis. And then breathing, thinking again about breathing down and out instead of up into our ears, because as soon as we get stressed or anxious or ramped up, that breathing pattern can start going up instead of bringing that breath down. Nasal breathing is huge. It helps keep position because we can't bring so much air in to crack our egg. And there's a lot with nasal. Well, Alice and I talked about this, but if you want to read a book, Breath is amazing.
Yeah, I've recommended it to them all. And I know that you and I could go on and on about all of this.
It's so good, like so good. So I'm reviewing these questions. Is there a difference in how you might approach all this newly postpartum later? Yes. So newly postpartum, when those tissues are healing, like C-section, vaginal, doesn't matter what kind of delivery you had, you have to respect that tissue healing, right? So I wouldn't put a lot of, like, very early on, it's all about just like gentle movement and breathing, and you're not increasing that pressure a ton because either that ab wall or that pelvic floor, one or the other, is healing. So you don't want to pressurize that system too much early on. But let's say I'm seeing someone for the first time a year postpartum, all that's healed, so I can challenge them a lot more than I would challenge someone like 2 or 4 weeks postpartum. So yeah, there's differences, like as far as tissue healing and how aggressive you can be. And the C-section, yeah, 5, yes. Keep I have a reel on C-section mobs if you want to check that out. But the Birth Healing Institute has a really good video on how to get all the layers of that scar mob. I can send it to Allison and she can share it to you guys, and like how to do scar mobs. So she's the one that I referenced, that 2 years that scar tissue can develop up to 2 years. So yes, the wedge. I love the wedge. If I'm known for anything, I hope it's the wedge. So yes, I would definitely get that book. Okay, let's go into, exhaling more than you inhale. This is a concept that will help your running, but also just your daily life and keep you more in that parasympathetic, like relaxed state, because as moms and women, we just tend to be doing all the things all the time and our minds are racing. So exhale more than you inhale, so those abs will engage. The more you exhale, the more those abs pull those ribs down, and the more abs you're going to use, right? So also just getting that air out will help circulation, your blood gases, but it also helps keep you stacked and keep that nervous system at bay. I haven't even really talked about the nervous system, which is rare for me, but that nervous system is important when we think about breathing. So here are a couple of concepts that you can think about if you're thinking about things you can do to keep more balance in your core system so your pelvic floor stays happier and you breathe better. These are things I do in my workouts, always warming up with that breath pelvic floor connection. So working on getting that pelvic floor or breath down into your pelvic floor, working on that rib mobility, feeling your abs and hamstrings so that you're getting more balance front to back. So that back and those hip flexors aren't running the show. Just creating balance, getting that egg stacked so that when you go into your workout or your run, you're more balanced. So you're going to use those muscles more efficiently. And then if you're like rehabbing something or you're addressing pain or symptoms, I tell people to bookend their workouts with their rehab exercises. So you get set, you work out, and then you reset. And that can help break your patterns of movement and get you more of that mobility. And then variety of movements. I know Allison's huge on this. Runners shouldn't just run. Runners need to do other exercises, lifting, all that stuff, because you want a variety in your movement. If you're always doing the same thing, you're going to become stuck in those movement patterns, and then you're going to limit your range of motion. Your joints are going to get angry. So intensities too. Someone wrote in or asked a question about leaking, and one of the things was they were running harder and more frequent that week. So if you're taxing that respiratory system and starting to get that compensation, you're breathing or cracking your egg, that pelvic floor probably just reached a point where it was unbalanced enough that the front of the pelvic floor just couldn't hold against the impact of running. So stack that egg. That's like the moral of the story. Just stack your egg. Grippy socks are like one of my favorite things. I think a lot of people get back pain. If you think about like walking on ice, like it's slippery, you're kind of sliding around. The first thing you're gonna do is do this, right? To stabilize and crack your egg. Like you're gonna be like, ah, or if you're trying to tiptoe, like in your kids' rooms, crack your egg. So if you're not sensing the floor, if you're wearing socks on like hardwoods or slippery surfaces and you're sliding all over the place, or the inserts of your shoes are really slick, or your socks are really slick and you're kind of moving in your shoe as you're running, that can really ramp up that tension in your back and your hip flexors. So grippy socks, which I literally wear all the time, like all the time, ground you a little bit more. And this helped me so much with my pubic symphysis pain and my prolapse, is to just get more grounded so I wasn't like creating all that tension trying to stabilize myself. So if you have any of those issues, grippy socks is a really quick, easy thing you can do. Okay, what do we got for time? Okay, so I can send these 3 exercises if you guys don't have time to go through them right now. What do you think, Allison? I had 3 exercises you can use for warm-ups.
Yeah, I have time to stay on, and if they don't, it could be in the recording. So it's
okay, cool. I have to plug my computer in before I lose you because that wouldn't be good. Okay, so I'm going to take you
unshare. So you're big.
Yes. Let me stop share. Is that good? Am I big now? Cool. Okay.
Yep.
So I need to adjust my computer so you can see me. Okay, so let's start. If you guys have a wall to put your feet up on, or you can use a chair, I'm going to show you 3, or you could just watch. You don't have to do this with me. I can demonstrate for you. These are 3 exercises that you can use to get that connection in your breath to pelvic floor, to get your abs and hamstrings on, get that rib mobility to kind of get set for running. So the first one is, I always use a block between my knees, but you would put your feet up a wall. This is a good hamstring one. Block between the knees, you're dorsiflexing your feet. You are gonna kind of dig your heels down and roll your pelvis up so that your back is flat and I'll do it this way so you can see here. So those hamstrings are digging into the wall, right? You're rolling your pelvis back. Those ribs are closed. So you feel your whole spine on the ground. Your back should be relaxed, your abs and hamstrings on, and just breathing all the way down to your pelvic floor. So when you breathe into your pelvic floor, you want it more in the back. So like you're breathing into your butt. If you breathe down and you feel like it's going in the front and like you're gonna lose control, you're gonna leak, or like it just doesn't feel good, you have to get that pelvis rolled back more. And the trick with finding more of a neutral or a posterior pelvic position is not clenching your glutes. Your glutes cover the back of your pelvic floor. So if you're trying to get more balance in the front, in the back of your pelvic floor, and then you're clenching, you're going to create a lot of tension where you're trying to open up and relax. So just getting in this position, working on that rib cage. I tell people when you exhale, your bra should become looser. So that rib cage is closing, your bra strap is looser. When you inhale, those ribs kind of expand into your bra. So if you hold that for 4 to 5 breaths and do a couple sets, your hamstrings should be very awake after that one. My other favorite position is all fours. And this like looks so easy, but it can be super effective in just getting that rib cage back, rounding, not squeezing your glutes, right? you're working on that rib closure. So these abs are on, and then you're breathing into your back. So I tell people, once you get in all fours, you have to have a long neck, push up, a rainbow back, and you stay over your hands. A lot of people like to shift back and then you lose your abs. So here, that breath is going down the back, so you feel stretch into your butt, and then exiting or exhale from the pelvic floor back up. So the more air that you exhale, the more abs have to pull those ribs and close those ribs, the more abs you're going to feel. So just breathing all the way down your back into your butt and then exhaling out the front. So it's like a breath cycle. And that's going to help connect diaphragm and pelvic floor, work on your rib mobility, wake up your abs.
In that position, what would you recommend? I know there's a few of us on here that are like rectus dominant, like ab grippers. So in the all fours position, breathing, what would you recommend to like help not do that?
So if you get those ribs, like once you get that connection or close those ribs, your oblique should be on, right? And once you get that connection, if you gently think about like drawing in your belly button a little bit, I really hesitate with that cue because people usually do this and then their ribs stick out and it's not what we want. But think about like drawing in. So those transverse abs, you should feel a wrap around. You shouldn't feel just the six-pack muscle, right? So the more you exhale, the more those obliques and those transverse abs should be pulling, and you should feel a little bit soft on your six-pack muscle if you do that drawing in motion, but that can take a little bit of practice. Yeah. You can also work more in a neutral spine. You don't have to round like a rainbow. I usually tell people to round like a rainbow if they're really flared in their ribs or they just can't feel their abs because they're so lengthened. Getting those abs in a shortened position can help strengthen them so that eventually you can be in a neutral position and feel them. But yeah, you can totally work with a neutral spine on that and just feel those ribs move under your bra. So your bra gets looser as you exhale and then tighter as you inhale. And then my favorite running exercise that's super easy to do when you're running, like if you start to feel like your back is tight or like your pelvic floor is feeling heavy or your breathing pattern is off, finding like a tree or a pole or something stable and holding on to it if this was a pole. So getting on your heels and just, if you want to be in a neutral spine, that's fine. But in order to breathe into your back, you have to close the front. So you close the front with your abs to breathe into your back. You can hold here, you can get more into a 90, or you can get into a full squat. In that full squat, you should feel like good opening in the sides of your ribs. But just again, that cycle breath. So you're inhaling down your back into your butt or your pelvic floor and then out the front to really close those ribs. I feel like I just like been spewing on you for a long time. Any questions?
I just love that idea of the cycle breath, like breathing it down to the back and then up the front. I haven't really thought of it that way, but it's a really good way of cueing it.
I like just came up with it like a month ago because I kept having people like, it was like too much to think about, right? Because I'm like, breathe into your back, breathe into your pelvic floor, close your ribs, like, and they're like, I don't know. And I'm like, okay, just breathe down your back and up your front. So yeah, that visual can really help. And I have a squat position in all fours reels that I show like the arrows and the cues for those squat breath and the all fours breath. So
yeah, I will link a few of your good reels. I'll post the recording of this and then link some of the reels that you've been talking about in the underneath. But yeah. I think a lot of them follow you already because I've recommended it. Yeah.
Awesome.
They're shaking their head, yes.
Awesome. Yes, I hope you guys got a lot out of this, and I hope I didn't overwhelm you. But if I did, maybe going back and like trying to, take a bite, and kind of chew off a little bit more, because it's just it's a different way of thinking about things when you think of like the whole body and like the pressure aspect and the breathing and all that. But that's just how we work.
One of the things you said, and you said it a couple of times that I want to just like circle back to, is in relation to prolapse and pelvic floor issues, it's not necessarily like a weakness, but just that it's not in a good position. So it could be actually tightness or like pulling because of scars. I think that's a huge thing. And Carrie, I sent you another video sort of related to that like biotensegrity model of, I don't know, it's something that I've been like reading a lot about recently, but how it's actually like tightness and pulling in different places in like the web that is your body that like puts everything out of whack. And that is really what pelvic floor symptoms can be.
Yeah, like the fascial connections and the kinetic chains. Yeah, because it's never just one part of your body. It's never just one muscle. One muscle might be screaming at you, and that's what you're paying attention to. But you have so much going on, even between body systems. Like you think about your gut system and your pelvic, like that. Those are very intertwined.
Actually, she's not on the call right now, but this is a question I will ask you for her. There's another girl in the group that is on antibiotics and is having a considerable amount of gut issues, and now she's noticing her like diastasis is feeling worse. Like, could that be a connection?
Are the antibiotics causing an imbalance in her gut biome that's causing constipation, that's causing pressure on her ab wall? Because that could be like effect there. Yeah.
Okay. That's sort of what we were thinking is the relationship, but
yeah, antibiotics, like I feel like they should be taken with probiotics like all the time. But
oh yeah,
I'm not a doctor. Like, yeah, the gut biome is so important, and I'm glad that it's getting more attention because that is like our immunity. 80% of it's in our gut, so it's when you kill those things.
Hey, Allison and Addie together, I have kind of a question maybe for both of you. So Allison might know from that I kind of have like this like nagging right hip, and it's just nagging like all the time. And my question is, how long and a lot of this work is really new for me. Like, so when we are applying ourselves, Allison, I feel like we're going really fast. Like all of a sudden this week, my body hit like whoa, I'm actually like, my abs are fatigued, I'm tired. Like, I feel like we're going really fast. How long do we put in this work before like a nag is like, hey, maybe something more?
That's a good question.
Question.
I think one thing that we haven't talked about so far in the mentorship, and Addie touched on it a little bit, is that there's also, we've talked a lot of like front to back and total stacking, but you can have right to left asymmetries that play a huge part of that. And that just like is a whole nother can of worms.
And I tell like that single leg stance,
yeah,
like that adductor and those abs pull you to a side. So when I was watching your arch video, someone asked about like a tight inner thigh. And that tight inner thigh on the right, I think it was on the right, can
I think that was Deanna actually,
from really shifting to the left. And so if you're spending more time in stance on your right because you can't get to your left because that right inner thigh doesn't let go, then you're going to have this like left to right imbalance, which can really screw with things. We're heavy. We tend to be right side driven. We're a little heavier on our right side with our liver. A lot of us are right-handed. Just how our diaphragm connects to our spine drives us to the right side. So usually the right inner thigh and ab wall is tighter than the left. Not always though.
Yeah, and that's something we're actually going to talk more about in week 6. But we did do, that like 3-point bear position, Deanna, from last week in the workout, like doing that where you're getting more links along. So on your left knee, we're internally rotating more on that left side and getting a lot more length on the right side with that right foot on the wall. That might be a good one to spend a little bit more time in, just like throwing like a dart at but generally speaking, and I think your foot pattern also, we did the foot patterns last week, your foot pattern also kind of says the same story. With that.
Yeah, the single leg on the right side made my hip very angry this week.
The single leg.
We did this the exercise number 1 had single legs get up, single leg stand.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Anyway, thank you. We don't.
Yeah, I did a reel on like a right side stretch. I can share that with you. That's one of the ones I give to my right hip people to like get their right rib cage more expanded and like go and get them over on their left side. That was a while ago, but I can send it to you, Allison. I'll just dig it.
I'm the same way too. Like I'm a lot more compressed on the right side, and then I have a hard time loading onto my left, and it's one of those things that like that it's super important. I think Deanna, that is part of what's going on with you, but I'm just trying to layer all the things on at once, but we will get there, I promise.
Yeah, so much to learn, right?
I know.
It's good stuff. Cool. Well, thank you so much for having me. Feel free to message me with questions. I love questions. If you guys have any later.
Yeah, I will.
Hopefully you learned a lot that you can implement into.
I definitely learned a lot. And there was one thing that you said, that the mini punches I love. And Natalie, I think we were laughing about the other day, putting together all the different like cues to remember. Because I say push with the tush, and then I shared something from Brianna Battles yesterday, and she said tits over toes. So we have like push with the tush and tits over toes, and now we're gonna add mini punches.
You need like a song, like a jingle, like
Yeah. Yeah.
That's awesome. Cool.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, if any of you have questions, send them over to me and I'll shoot them over, or reach out to Addie on Instagram. And yeah, thank you again.
Cool. Thank you so much for joining me. It was nice to meet you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming.
Yes. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.